The way this works, you're probably familiar. We have video and where you can see me and then I can see your questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, type them in the chat. And there's a lot of things going on today. Obviously, the SpaceX IPO is a big one. A lot of the Artemis 3 announcement this week. A lot of things happening in politics in the country in Ukraine. So I'm happy to answer any of your questions about space, about politics, about the baseball, anything you want to talk about. Please type them in the chat, and I'll be following the live chat there as people start to pile in to ask me anything. So the big news of today is the SpaceX IPO. It jumped up about over 20% in the first few hours, which is not surprising at all. I wrote a Substack about that last week. There's, probably 70 or 80% of the stock market is emotion, and people really love SpaceX and Elon Musk. And so it's not surprising that it jumped up. When you look at the fundamentals don't match up with that valuation. It's now, I guess it's trading over 100 times revenue from last year's revenue. This year's revenue should be a lot higher, but anyway, it's the stock market. So Elon is the first ever human being who's a trillionaire, which is a big deal. So we'll see where that goes and where that ends up. But if you have any questions specifically to ask me, shoot them in the chat. I don't see any questions in the chat. I see a list of folks here. But the other big news in the space universe was the Artemis 3 crew was announced. Also wrote a Substack article about that, so you can read that. Artemis 3 is going to be an important test flight, so that was kind of exciting for me as a test pilot. They're going to hopefully test out the 2 lunar landers. I had some questions that came in about that mission. What if only one lunar lander is available? So in the Artemis program, SpaceX and Blue Origin are both building a moon lander, the spaceship that's going to take the astronauts down to the surface of the moon. They both have issues, so we'll see which one's ready. If only one of them is ready on Artemis 3, I would assume that would be the one that NASA will use on Artemis 4, which is actually going to land on the moon. But we will see what they say. The big issues there are that SpaceX has a huge technical challenge. The SpaceX lander is 170 feet tall. It's huge. It's absolutely massive. A lot of the folks that I know who are working on the program are just rolling their eyes. They're like, it's kind of a crazy thing to try and land 170 foot tall. But it's like, here's my my drink thing. It's like trying to land this on the moon. If it's more than 1.5 degrees out of level, it'll tip over and fall over. So that's not optimum. It also requires, the numbers I've been hearing are 12. I've heard anywhere between 8 and 20, but 12 is the latest number I've been hearing. Starship launches full of fuel. So the Starship is the world's biggest rocket. It's this massive thing, bigger than a Saturn V, that's been launching out of Texas the last few years. So 12 of those have to launch full of fuel and refuel this massive lander, and then it'll go to the moon, and then it'll be reusable, which is its own challenge. So that's SpaceX. On the other hand, the Blue Origin lander, it's called Blue Moon, has its own problems because it's a lot smaller. It's only 50 feet tall, and it's not reusable, and it doesn't require refueling, so it can go to the moon. But it also launches on the New Glenn rocket, and then New Glenn is the one that just blew up a couple weeks ago. So both of those have issues. Okay. I got some questions. How do I see a Democratic administration taking office in 2029, changing NASA's relationship and dependence on SpaceX? That's a great question. The dependence on SpaceX is a problem because SpaceX last year did over 90% of American launches, over 50% of global launches. So SpaceX dominates the launch market. You can't just stop dependence on it. I think there's some real concerns with Elon Musk having over 80% control of SpaceX. Some of the things that he's done with global far right parties around the world, promoting such political influence in America. The biggest problem was what he did with Doge, the destruction he did to the government, and also the data that he sucked up from the government. And the value of the SpaceX company is not in its launch business; it's in Starlink, and most importantly, it's in XAI. SpaceX is very much an AI company, and all the data that he got uncontrolled, unregulated, just got all of our information. So I think there's some real problems. There could be antitrust issues there. So we're going to have to look at it, but we can't just cut dependence on SpaceX. They launch almost all of the missions that NASA flies. It's important. Charles Houston, the Blue Origin vehicle seems to be far simpler. I think you're exactly right. I think the Blue Origin one has a lot higher probability of being the lander that actually lands astronauts on the moon, because it doesn't require those 12 starships full of fuel. It's only 50 feet tall versus 170 feet tall, so it's less likely to flip over once you land. And then, once you land, the astronauts on the SpaceX, they have to get out to the side and go up this big elevator. And putting, hundreds of pounds on the side of a really tall, skinny thing is going to cause it to tip over even more. Anyway, the SpaceX one, or I'm sorry, the Blue Moon, the Blue Origin lander is a lot simpler. So I think it's probably the one more likely to do it. Why does NASA allow SpaceX to fuel after the crew's boarded? This is a big issue 5 years ago or so when we first started flying crew on SpaceX. I was not for that. SpaceX, the reason why NASA lets SpaceX do it is that they have to do it. The Falcon rocket, when you're launching humans, has very little margin. There's not a lot of extra gas on board. It's like if you're driving your car home, the warning light's on and the tank is on empty as you pull into your driveway. Um, so when you load up a rocket with fuel, it tends to burn off. And so in the space shuttle, we had something called stable replenish, where you were constantly putting fuel into the tank, because if you stop doing that, the liquid hydrogen and oxygen would vaporize and leave. And because they don't have enough fuel margin, they have to fill it up um, at the very last minute. So they put the crew on board. On the space shuttle, we boarded about 3 hours before launch. So they had to have fueling done, I forgot, like 6 hours before launch or something like that. And the Falcon doesn't have that much margin in fuel. That's why they have to do it. What other questions does everybody have? We're getting a pretty good group here. For the Ask Me Anything, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the side there. And also, if you can subscribe to my Substack, I'd appreciate it. Just started doing it a couple of weeks ago. It's been a lot of fun. Subscribers are coming on board, which is great, but that helps a lot. One, I did two this week. One of them was called The Normalization of Deviance, where I talked about the NASA's two space shuttle accidents, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003. And the real problem there was not that the managers were doing something actively wrong. The problem with those space shuttle accidents were that they had normalized deviance. So there were bad things happening, there were warning signals, and NASA management had learned that in Challenger's case, leaking gas never killed anybody. In Columbia's case, foam hitting the orbiter never killed anybody. They had learned the false lesson that um, these deviant things were normal. They normalized deviance. And in the same way, there's a lot of things happening in our politics. I just posted that just today. We announced that we're pulling a massive amount of mostly air and naval forces out of NATO. That's not normal, especially while Russia is literally waging the most massive European war since World War II. That is not a normal thing. We just nominated a second director of national intelligence who has no national security experience. The law says the person has to have significant national security expertise, and this person has none. We're just ignoring the law. That's not normal. That's deviant. So we need to make sure that these things do not become normalized. In NASA's case, it led to the space shuttle accident. what I'm worried for democracy, it'll lead to a democracy accident. So we need to not do that. I see a question here. When non-Russian crew members fly on the Soyuz, do they get same quality of support? So in other words, like me. Um, yeah, I felt when I flew with the Russians, they supported me. They were great. The trainers that I had were very helpful. Um, I didn't have any lack of support. Now, the point there about Dave Wolf flying the Mir, that was 30 years ago. That was before the space station. That was when we were just learning how to do things with the Russians. I never felt that I didn't have the support of the Russians. I know their spy agency like to follow us around. There's some funny story. I went to some meetings like with other crew. Another crew astronaut was like, "Hey Terry, come to our thing today." So I would go say hi, and then the next day the boss would hear, "Hey, why was Terry Virts at this other cruise thing?" He was. So anyway, they were keeping an eye on all of us. Um, Phil, did they ever get to the bottom of the hole apparently drilled into the Soyuz? So if you remember a few years ago, all of a sudden there was a leak on the space station and they couldn't find it. And it was on the Russian segment. What you do is you close the hatch and you figure out which side the air pressure is dropping on. And whichever side the pressure is going down, the leak is somewhere over there. And as you go, there's probably several dozen hatches. And as you close all these hatches, you can narrow it down. And they narrowed it down to the Soyuz and they couldn't find it. And in the BAO, the orbital module of the Soyuz, right behind the bathroom, they pulled everything out and there was a little hole and you could see all of these scratch marks on it. So if you imagine this spherical metal container, it was clear that somebody took a drill and as they were trying to drill, because it wasn't a flat surface, it was slipping on the curved surface, and they finally got it to stick and they just drilled a hole in it and they drilled it right behind the bathroom, which is smart because it would be hard to use. And so I think what they were trying to do, and it was clear that they had done it on the ground because all the filings had fallen down and were all stuck in the mesh in one spot. And if it had happened in space, the filings would have just flown everywhere and they would have been uniformly everywhere. But because it happened on Earth before launch, they all fell in one spot. Anyway, my theory is that somebody was hoping to sabotage that Soyuz launch. When they get into space, if they would have seen a pressure leak in that module, the BAO, they would have had to do an emergency landing, and it would have caused damage to Russia's space program, obviously. And of course, it, it didn't. And what happened was some foam from the bathroom area got sucked into the hole and plugged it, so it wasn't leaking. Except for after a few months, it finally got sucked out the hole and the air leaking started. So I think it wasn't what they had expected, but they never publicly said who did it. They may know that, they're very secretive. They don't tell us what's going on there. They did blame it on a NASA astronaut. They said there was an astronaut who was having emotional problems and needed to get back to Earth, and it was complete BS, totally not true at all. Really reflected on the character of the Russian space program to throw one of our astronauts under the bus for something that somebody on their side tried to sabotage their spaceship. So it's never been discussed and we just ignore it. So, um, launching on the shuttle versus Soyuz. They were both awesome. I love the space shuttle. I was a pilot, so I actually got to fly the thing. I had a lot to do. The space shuttle is a spaceship that you fly. The new SpaceX and stuff are automated. There's nothing to do. Everything's automated. So as a test pilot, that wasn't very interesting to me, but the space shuttle was very interesting. The space shuttle was much bigger and we had windows. In the Soyuz, you launch in a metal can there because the capsule is very not aerodynamic. The capsule can't survive in the wind that you get when you launch in atmosphere. So they put this metal, it's called an obyapatel, on top of the capsule, so you can't see anything. And then there's no controls. It's a Soviet ICBM, so it's all automated also. It's very violent. I mean, you launch. I mean, the shuttle and SLS is kind of this majestic thing going up. The Soyuz is just, I mean, it's designed to launch nuclear missiles at America. That's why they built it. So, also between staging, it was like bam, and you're thrown to 0 G, and then a few seconds later, the next stage engine's light, and the separation happens, and bam! So it's very violent for staging. But the shuttle was pretty violent too. When the solid rockets came off, um, the rocket motors that pushed them away fired, and it was like somebody shooting a shotgun right next to your ear. It was pretty crazy. I see another question. Is it difficult to get into the Soyuz capsule on the ground for launch? It absolutely is. And so it's hard to get in the space shuttle too because it's on its back. And so you're crawling in this thing. It like if somebody took your office and rotated it 90 degrees, you would be very disoriented. And you're in a big, bulky 40-pound spacesuit, so it's hard to move around. But the Soyuz is really small. So and you have to crawl down this hatch, and I was on the side, so I think I went in first. I got out last. So I guess I was in the capsule longer than my other two crewmates. But you go in on the ground. The BAO, that orbital module, um, has a hatch. You have to go into that, and then you have to go from the BAO into uh, the ESA, the Spuskyami apparatus, the descent, ascent and descent module. And so you have to go through a couple hatches, and it's small and tight and blah blah blah. So it was a very tight fit. And getting out, the problem with my mission, usually it ends up on the side, and this big Russian guy goes in and drags you out and puts you on a couch, and you're like getting adjusted to gravity. But when I came back to Earth after 200 days, the capsule bounced, it did a 360, and it landed straight up. So we had to crawl ourselves out of the top, and then they grabbed you and put you in the chair. So getting out was really crazy. My head was fine if I was sitting still, but as soon as I moved it, everything started spinning, and you have to move your head to go from the right seat to the center seat out the top. So that was crazy. What other questions do y'all have? Doing our Ask Me Anything. And by the way, if you get a shot for those new folks here, please subscribe to my Substack. I'd appreciate it. Doing a few articles per week and posts and occasional Ask Me Anythings and videos. The big news today, like I talked about earlier, is the SpaceX IPO. We'll see how long that goes. There's a few technical aspects of that IPO in terms of what institutional investors have to invest in it. It's not being listed on the S&P 500 immediately, but it did get fast tracked. I think to the NASDAQ. It got fast tracked to several different lists, which means that tens or hundreds of billions of institutional dollars are going to be buying that stock. So there's going to be a demand signal for that for the SpaceX stock. Is there any future for Russia's manned spaceflight post ISS? The Russian space program is in bad shape. I'll say that politically. It sucks. There's no innovation there. The people who work there are just aging out. I mean, there's a lot of old folks in there, and young Russians are not flocking to be engineers and work in the space program. When I was there, this was a decade ago when they first invaded Ukraine, the Energia, which is like the Russian Boeing, if you will, those people were making something like $1,000 a month. And Moscow is was one of the most expensive cities in the world. So it was a terrible career choice. They haven't built anything new. The Soyuz first flew in 1967. They're still flying it. The ISS modules that they have are the regurgitated mirror modules from the 1980s and 90s. So yeah, there's no future for the Russian space program. The entire country is on a wartime footing. They're about 40% of their budget is spent on the military. So they're really good at building drones and artillery shells and stuff like that. They're not really good at innovating, the commercial space travel, or human space travel. So I do not, and they realize it too when you hear them talk. Difficult time adjusting to gravity. I think everybody does. Every human being. It's just like the first few days, especially, are really disorienting. For me, I had a really terrible headache for the first couple days. It's just hard to know how to move. You move with your hands and you hold things with your feet. So everybody does that. My third morning in space, it was like a light switch went off, and all of a sudden I felt good. I see. Let's see. What was the view from the cupola? It's hard to describe. So I wrote a National Geographic photography book. I helped make an IMAX movie called A Beautiful Planet. The book is View from Above. I'm doing a space photography exhibit in Europe right now. Like, and I do speaking is what I do for a living. So trying to describe the view is amazing. We installed the cupola on my first shuttle flight, and I was actually the first guy to like open the window cover and look out the cupola window. It was pretty cool. I was in there with Jeff Williams. Um, and we did that. My crewmate Nick Patrick was outside. He like pulled the bolts off the window covers, and then once he was clear, I opened it up. So when he came inside a few hours later, got out of his spacesuit. I went down. I'm like, Nick, come here, and I pulled him down. He was just outside looking at the world. There's a picture of Nick hanging off the cupola. It's one of the most famous um, NASA pictures ever. It's one of the most famous NASA pictures. Google Nick Patrick on the cupola, you'll see it. And I brought him down there, and I saw his face just got so happy, and his eyes got big, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is better than being outside." So the view from the cupola is pretty cool. It's cool because you can go into it, and you're surrounded by windows on all sides. So it was pretty cool. Since the Ukraine Russia war, do you keep in touch with cosmonauts? So before 2022, I kept in touch with a lot of cosmonauts very frequently. When they were here for training, they'd come to my house, and they'd visit other astronauts, and we'd go hang out. And I really enjoyed my time with them. After the war happened, three of the cosmonauts that I was with in space ended up joining the Duma to support Putin. There's one guy that I know that actually criticized Putin in public, which is a dangerous thing to do, but most of the cosmonauts support the war. They certainly are not saying anything against the war. Many of them are publicly in favor of it. So they don't come to visit my house anymore when they're in Houston, nor do I go visit them. I've been publicly promoting reducing our cooperation with Russia. I think it's a moral travesty that we're launching our astronauts on the Soyuz, or that we're bringing Russian Air Force cosmonauts to launch on our SpaceX capsule, the crown jewel of our technology. It's like doing some scientific expedition with Germans in 1943. My family's German, so I'm not against Germans, all of them. But when they're waging a heinous war, that's not the time to do cooperation. So, yeah, there's not a lot of communication. There's a few that I stay in touch with, but I don't talk about them or anything because it's dangerous for them. How many spacewalks did I do? That's a good question. So on my first flight, I didn't do any because I was a pilot, and NASA didn't let space shuttle pilots do spacewalks. They didn't want the pilot to float away because somebody had to land a space shuttle. But on my second flight, when I was at the ISS for 200 days, I did three. The main thing we did was cables. I was a power and data cable guy. So I was like a cable guy coming to your house, putting in Wi-Fi or whatever. We put 140 meters, so it was like 400 feet of cable. It was the most ever cable that takes power and data from the space station to the docking port. So when our astronauts go up on a SpaceX or a Boeing capsule, when they dock, the power and data are from the cables that I installed. And then my other task was putting grease on the robotic arm. So this big 50-foot long robotic arm that grabs modules and moves them around, and can also grab cargo vehicles and attach them to the station. It had been out in space for a long time, and the bolts needed grease. So I was literally squirting grease into bolts and putting cable down. So that was my space walk. Every once in a while, I'd stop and look out and see creation from God's point of view. It was amazing. Let me see. How soon will space tourism be high end but widely accessible? So that's a good question. Yeah, NetJets. Is it silly to invest in SpaceX? So I'm definitely not going to give whatever investing advice I give. You should do the opposite. SpaceX is more valuable than Boeing plus AT&T plus whatever. It's trading at 100 times last year's revenue. This year's revenue is going to be higher. So by any normal market metric, it the price doesn't make sense, but the market isn't about making sense. It's about how people feel, and people love the company. But as far as space tourism becoming normal, a lot of Americans can fly. Like when I was a kid, flying was kind of a luxury. The price of flying has come down a lot. For Southwest used to have $49 specials until we invaded Iran, but um, you know, you can travel for a couple $100, and you're going about point 0.8 times the speed of sound. On a rocket, if you want to get into orbit, you've got to go 30 times that speed, or more than 30 times the speed of an airliner. And remember, from physics, energy is 1/2 mv squared. So you have to square your velocity to figure out how much energy you have. So 30 squared is 900. So getting into space is about 1,000 times as much energy. Also, you can land an airliner, the air slows you down, and the tires and the brake pads slow you down. But for a spaceship going 30 times that speed, you need a much more sophisticated and expensive way to slow down. Plus, all the mission control and helicopters and grounds, all that stuff is a lot more. So space will always be you in order to get in orbit, you will always have to go 30 times as fast as an airliner. So I don't think that space tourism is going to be anywhere remotely accessible. It won't be on the NetJets level of accessibility. It'll be in the, Learjet, or maybe not Gulfstream, maybe Challenger, business jet ownership level. People who own business jets will be able to do space tourism, but people who fly on Southwest will not. I don't think. Anyway, that's my thing, and that's just based on physics and energy. How will Artemis 3 fly with no lunar lander ready? They won't. Artemis 3 won't fly. Well, I'm not the NASA administrator, so ask Jared Isaacman. But my understanding is that the whole purpose of Artemis 3, originally it was going to be the moon landing mission. They were going to land on the moon, and they realized that the lunar landers aren't ready for that yet. So now they're making it an Apollo 9 kind of analog mission where they launch the capsule with humans on board and then launch the unmanned lunar lander. They dock in Earth orbit and do all the test pilot stuff. They check it out. And hopefully they'll have both SpaceX and Blue Origin lunar landers ready. So they'll check one out, undock, and then go fly into the next one, check it out, and in Earth orbit. Once they're checked out, then they can go land on the moon. Although I do think NASA's going to want an unmanned landing on the moon just robotically first before humans actually take it down. That's a different question. So if neither of those landers is ready, it doesn't make any sense to fly Artemis 3. They don't need to fly an Earth orbit. They don't need to fly another test flight of Orion. The Orion capsule's flown 3 times already, once with humans on board last month, and with Artemis 2 months ago. So I don't think it'll fly with no lander. I flew in Europe, but did you fly with NATO members? What do I think of their capabilities? I The best years of my life were flying F-16s in Germany. I was in the, where is it? There it is. No, there. The 22nd Fighter Squadron. That was my squadron in Germany, flying F-16s right there. So we flew with the Belgians, with the French, with the Brits, with the Dutch, the Danes. We flew with a lot of NATO members. We invited Poles and Hungarians. Now, this is in the 90s. This is when they were just brand new, they weren't even in NATO yet. They wanted to be in NATO. So I flew with all of them. NATO capability. NATO has good equipment. They don't have nearly enough of it. They don't have nearly enough soldiers in terms of Western Europe, France, England, Germany. Germany is doing a massive buildup right now because America's pulled out, which is good and bad. Having Germany rearm should bring you a little bit of pause. Poland is quickly becoming the second most powerful military in Europe behind Ukraine. Ukraine is by far the most strong military in Europe. You would not want to mess with Ukraine. The Russians lose 1,300 men a day, killed and wounded, against Ukraine, and gain no territory. The Baltics spend 5% of their GDP on military. Now they're very small, but they're spending a lot. Finland is very well armed. They have over 200,000 men and women in their reserves. The British Army is 75,000. Finland has over 200,000 in reserve. So the closer you are to Russia, the better your capability is, and more importantly, the better your mentality is. Like, you realize all the evil that Russia has done to Estonia for the last century, and to Poland, and they're not going to let that happen again. The farther west you go, they've gotten lazy and they're not nearly as ready. But Europe has really, so they, on one hand, they've picked up the ball, and America stopped supporting Ukraine when Trump got elected. So Europe is giving uh, all the support to Ukraine now. Last week, the House passed a bill that will hopefully give a few $1 billion to Ukraine. We'll see if the Senate does it and if Trump vetoes it. But the problem with Europe is they don't have a Patriot missile. Like, unless Ukraine has our Patriot missiles, they don't have ballistic missile defense. And that's really critical. It's killing them. I was in Ukraine. I sat listening to air raids go off. I could hear Patriots launching at these missiles coming in. Um, Europe has had many years to build their own Patriot, and they haven't done that yet. They're completely dependent on our F-35. And look, I've been to the F-35 factory in Lockheed, in Fort Worth, Texas. They built my F-16s. I'm a huge fan. I love Lockheed Martin. Um, if I was European, I would think twice about buying an F-35, given the amount of disdain that this administration has had towards Europe. And will we even sell it to them? And will we upgrade their software? So all of the nonsense that's happened for the last year and a half here in America is going to really hurt American defense contractors in the coming decades, because a lot of countries don't depend on us. If you were Denmark, would you buy F-35s? Would you buy any American anything while we're threatening to invade them and take Greenland from them? Canada, we're threatening to make them the 51st state. Would you buy American defense stuff? So we've done some really profound damage that's going to hurt American working class people who have jobs at Lockheed and Boeing for decades to come. And worse than that, we've told Russia, like, we're not going to support NATO in an invasion. So there's a lot of bad stuff that's happening that we need to undo. And if you look at my Substack article from this week, the normalization of deviance, like, the stuff is not normal. It's deviant, and we need to undo it as quickly as we can. Let me see here. Beating China to the moon, Alex. I think that is like the top issue, because if China sends astronauts to the moon before we do, the entire world will look at them and say, America was great in the 20th century, but China is the 21st century country. The future is China, the past is America. And that is bad. That'll be bad for America in a lot of ways. And people will think, well, maybe communism, maybe surveillance state, maybe one party, no freedom is not that bad. So I think it's very important for that. America's still in the game. Freedom is still the way to go. So I think it's very important. Our odds of beating them, I think, they're good, but they're not great. I mean, China's slow and steady, and they don't have to worry about midterms, and they're not fighting wars that they don't need to fight. They're not spending trillions of dollars in deficit spending every year. So they have lots of their own problems, but so I think it's good, not great. Go Ukraine. Amen. 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 Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. George Carlin was right. I'm looking at questions. When will the war in Iran end? I don't know. I mean, there's no good answer. This is not a war that we can win. There's just a question of the least bad results. So this is why it should not have been started. This is why on day 61, Congress should have had a vote on it. Here we are, almost 4 months later, we're in violation of the War Powers Act, and no one's doing anything about it. We're normalizing. It's deviant to ignore the law. That's what's happening today. So unfortunately, unless you completely change the regime in Iran, they're still going to want to fight us. I mean, these are the people that invented suicide bombing. If we bomb some of their stuff, they don't care. If we kill some of their people, they don't care. They're fanatics, right? They want to wipe Israel off the earth. They want to wipe us off the earth. So the only way to change that behavior is to get rid of them. They don't mind suffering um, if they think it'll get them to go to heaven. So there's a problem with dealing with fanatics like that, because normal negotiating techniques where you think you're dealing with a rational actor on the other side doesn't apply. During the Cold War, the Soviets were rational actors. They were evil, but they were rational, and we could manage that relationship and deal with them. That's not the way it is with Iran, and they can keep the straits largely shut down. And unfortunately, the president is disconnected from reality. I mean, the president of the United States does not live in reality, and that's a really profoundly bad place for us to be. So, I I don't know. Iran is going to want money. They're not going to give up their nuclear power, and they're going to want some degree of control over the Strait of Hormuz. And for them to drop that, we're going to have to send troops on the ground and replace the regime like we did with Saddam in 2003. I don't think we want to do that. So it's a question of the least bad options. Do I think Russia will escalate before Trump leaves office? The I don't think so, because they're so badly decimated right now. I mean, they can't even take a few meters of ground from Ukraine. And trust me, the Estonians and the Latvians, and especially the Poles and especially the Finns, are highly motivated. They're gonna Russia, I think, knows better than to go after them. Um, Once there's a ceasefire, then they can start to reconstitute. And the Russians have the combat experience, and all those other countries don't. So the real danger is going to happen once the war in Ukraine stops. That's when they're going to start reconstituting, and Putin can't undo the economy. That once you put your economy on a war footing, you can't undo it. The only way you undo it is you win the war or you lose the war. And so Putin is going to keep that economy going. So I see an Italian student interested in space sector. Their sponsorships to attain space beyond networking. That is a good question. I don't know. I haven't seen that. Um, I do not know. I have to answer that question. I don't know. I see. Would Mark Kelly make a good president? I can't tell you how much I would rather have President Kelly today than President Trump. Mark is a smart human being. I know him very well. I spent many months in space with his twin brother, Scott. He approaches problems from he's not an emotional or a ideological kind of person. So he would be a spectacular president, especially compared to who we are today. And I think there's several other Democrats who are um, in that, uh, in that category. And, there was a time when there were rational Republicans who would have approached things thoughtfully, but unfortunately that time is in our rearview mirror as a nation. So we'll see what Mark does. I think when Pete Hegseth came after him, and when they made that video that said, you don't have to follow illegal orders, which, by the way, of course you don't. Like, that's military training 101. But it was very prescient, because right after they made that video, we started bombing these boats in the Caribbean, and what many people say is extrajudicial killing. Certainly, there's no due process or whatever. So that coming after Mark and Alyssa Slotkin, and I think it was Jason Crow. There were several other military people that really raised their profile. So it would be wild to have a president who was an astronaut. I agree. I think that would be a pretty cool thing. You definitely get a perspective being an astronaut that very few people do. You see the world. I love traveling. I've been to all 7 continents. I love learning languages and talking to people from other countries. And the stuff that comes out of MAGA about Make America First and getting rid of brown people and immigrants are our problem. It's so small-minded and so just wrong-headed, that an astronaut should not have that perspective. So that would be one. And also, we're not ideological. Like, in the astronaut office, you never worried about politics or religion. It was like we had a mission, we worked with people who were different than you and got the mission done. And I think that kind of attitude would serve the country and serve the world in a very good way. So we'll see what happens. I haven't talked to Mark about this. I have no inside information, but we'll see if he runs for president or not. but we definitely need we need something. Orioles or Padres tonight. So somebody knows I like the Orioles. Of course, the Orioles. I don't have I have my Astros hat in the other room, but yeah. I grew up in Baltimore, longtime Orioles fan. So what other questions? All right, let's do maybe one or two more questions. How worried am I that MAGA will try to steal? I'm not worried. I know they're going to try and steal the election. I mean, just today they're trying to stop mail-in ballot voting. I did mail-in voting for 20 years in the military. I My first assignment was in Florida, so I was a Florida resident for 20 years. Mail-in balloting is fine. There's no problems with it. The problem with it is that for whatever reason, I don't know why more Democrats vote mail-in than in person. So by stopping mail-in ballot, they suppress a lot of Democrat votes. That's the thinking anyway. So that's just like blatant trying to voter suppression. Sending ICE agents in polling places, of course. The biggest worry that we should all have is the use of the intelligence community. You know, when Tulsi Gabbard went to get these Georgia voting machines a few months ago, that was that was wild. I mean, that was so over the top inappropriate. Tulsi Gabbard's the director of national intelligence. That job was created after 9/11 to coordinate all 18 government intelligence agencies. First of all, you're required to have extensive national security experience, which she did not. And certainly the Pulte guy that Trump just nominated had none. And the new guy, his name, I forgot his last name, he has no national security experience. So again, they're violating the law. But the fact that she went after voting machines, what does coordinating the CIA and NRO have to do with checking on the 2020 election? It has nothing to do with it. But our intel agencies have a lot of power. They have a lot of data. They've been spying on Americans ever since 9/11. And so they want to create a national database of voters and all this stuff that traditional Republicans would be up in arms. Don't give the government any more power. Trump wants to give the federal government a lot of power. So I'm extremely worried about this. Just having ICE around voting booths is going to make brown people nervous. I know this because I just ran for Congress in a Hispanic district, and I talked to my constituents who were terrified. I talked to this one old lady. I've told this story a bunch. She's like, Terry, I don't leave my house unless I have to. And she was an American. She's been voting for decades, but she's afraid to go out. So just intimidation will take some of the margin off. And Republicans are going to lose a lot of elections, but taking a few percent here and there may be the difference between the Senate and not, or a really tight House margin and a bigger margin. So I'm very worried about that. The Will I run for Congress or another office? I tell people if I decide to run for office again, they can just come shoot me and put me out of my misery. But I don't know. I don't know what I'll do. We'll see what the future is. All right, last question here, Phil. If the DOJ seizes ballots like in Georgia, what can be done to stop it? This is the problem. The Supreme Court is largely, overwhelmingly in favor of Trump. They gave him immunity. Like, you don't need immunity to do your job. You need immunity to break the law. And the Supreme Court gave him that. We don't have the House. The House has proven that they're feckless. Mike Johnson does anything that Trump wants. We don't have the Senate. We don't have the FBI. We don't have law enforcement agencies. And so there's very little. Some blue states might try to fight back, but then it's a terrible place. We are in a really bad place. The election needs to be so overwhelming like it was in Hungary. Nor if it was 51-49, Orban would have fought back, but it wasn't, and he couldn't fight back. So that's what we have to do this November. Not because I'm not a lifelong, partisan Democrat, but just I'm a lifelong partisan American, and to save the country, we need to get out of this craziness that we're in. But it's a lot more fun talking about space, but I am passionate about the country. So if we don't keep our democracy going, whatever we're doing in space won't matter that much. So anyway, thank you, everybody. It's been 45 minutes. I was only going to do 30, but this is great. Tell your friends and family, subscribe to my Substack, and I will see you around soon. Thanks, everybody, for showing up.